I'm Zach Corrigan, reporting for the World Socialist website. Today I'm joined by Joseph Kishore, who has written the perspective on today's World Socialist website, titled The Trump Administration's War Against Society. Joe's also running for president in the United States. He's the Socialist Equality Party's U.S. presidential candidate in the 2020 elections. Thanks for joining us today, Joe.
Thanks, Zach. Glad to be here.
So, first of all, just explain what you mean. The Trump administration's war against society. Strong words. What is this? What is the war?
Well, the Trump administration now is openly implementing a policy that will and that it knows will lead to the deaths of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people in the United States, opening up the economy under conditions of an expanding pandemic. The virus is not under control. And the administration is really pushing for a resumption of businesses, forcing workers to go back to work. And as I said, it's not just that this will lead to deaths, it knows that it will lead to deaths. A number of statements over the past several days from both Trump as well as individuals who are close to the administration. I found in particular the remarks of former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, which we examined in the statement, to be remarkable. I mean, he declares that this is like World War I and World War II, and people are going to die, and they have to sacrifice themselves for the cause.
He says now it's necessary to sacrifice to, quote, stand up for the American way of life. What is the American way of life that Christie and others are referring to?
Yeah, right. Sacrifice, but who's going to be sacrificed and for whom? The people who are being sacrificed are the workers, and they're being sacrificed at the altar of Wall Street, of corporate profit. You know, when they talk about the American way of life, I mean, what they're speaking about is that American workers have to get back to work, have to pump out profits for the corporate elite, have to make sure that they are doing everything they can to guarantee the lifestyle of the super rich. That's what they're concerned about, not, the health and safety of the population.
What is the actual state of the spread of the pandemic now? We hear a lot of talk about, flattening the curve or that there could be a second wave, but what's going on right now with the spread?
Yeah, well, these measures are taking place as the pandemic is in fact expanding. It's not really a question of a second wave because the first wave hasn't ended. There is some indication of a certain flattening in some of the major metropolitan areas where the pandemic first struck, in particular New York City, although that can be reversed very quickly. And there is also an undercounting of the cases and the deaths. But it is growing rapidly throughout the country, throughout the Midwest, in the South. States like Illinois, Nebraska, Iowa, New Mexico. I think it's growing rapidly in about 30 states, centered around meatpacking industry in particular, where there's enormous growth of the virus over recent weeks, meatpacking workers. And so the pandemic is not under control in the least. And the policies that they are implementing will lead to a vast acceleration. There's no doubt about that.
So I want to talk about what's behind the drive to send workers back to work amid pandemic conditions threatening their lives. You write that the homicidal policy of the Trump administration and the new Wall Street bull market are two sides of the same phenomenon. Can you draw that connection out for us?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to address this in terms of how this crisis has developed and how the ruling class has responded to it. I mean, first of all, they wanted to ignore it, downplay the significance of it. They took no measures to protect the population from the spread of the virus, even though there were warnings and that they knew that this would develop and it would have disastrous consequences. No measures were taken to protect the population. Then, as the crisis really escalated, they utilized it to implement a policy of what can only be described robbery and thievery on a massive scale. They implemented measures which have transferred trillions of dollars into Wall Street. The U.S. Federal Reserve is pumping $80 billion a day into the markets, which is going into the bank accounts of the super rich. And the stock market it has a record rise, really actually unprecedented in its history. It has been soaring as a result of the money that has been pumped into it by the U.S. Central Bank, the Federal Reserve. Well, all of that has to be paid for. They are bankrupting society to bail out the rich. And how is that going to be paid for? It has to be paid for through the exploitation of the working class, through the extraction of profits. And that's the compulsion for the return to work.
So just to review a little bit, what was actually done in response to the pandemic. I mean, in March, the U.S. Congress passed unanimously, every member of each Republican and Democrat in the Senate, passed the CARES Act, which was basically a bailout to the tune of trillions of dollars, I believe. And let's talk about this for a minute. Is that so? It's sort of hard to wrap your head around. It's such these great large sums of money are just created out of thin air, but it really is related to the production process. You're saying that money now that has been created and given to the banks and large corporations now has to be paid for essentially by workers going to work.
Well, the CARES Act, which was passed by Congress at the end of March, as you said, unanimously by Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. Senate, bankrolled the Federal Reserve's, in addition to the direct bailouts of corporations that was contained in the CARES Act. It also provided about $450 billion to the Federal Reserve to back their asset purchasing operations. And because of the way the Federal Reserve works, that can actually translate into $4 trillion, $5 trillion or more in actual asset purchases. So then the Federal Reserve goes and they finance through the printing of money, they buy up the assets of the banks, of the corporations, and that's transferred then to the balance sheet of the Fed. They also have zero interest rate policy, which means that the banks can borrow from the Fed at zero interest rates. I mean, the cumulative impact of all of this is a massive expansion of debt. I mean, you can't just create money. It has to, in the final analysis, be paid for. And where is all of wealth created? What is the source of all of the wealth of society? It's in the labor of the working class. So in the end, this is all claims upon the surplus value extracted from the working class. It is the labor of workers to produce profits and to finance the debt which is being accumulated. The other element of it, they bankrupted society. It will be paid for through massive austerity, and they're already doing that. Cuts in public education, cuts in healthcare, and government spending. Anything that goes to the working class will be slashed. The restructuring which is taking place. I mean, you have massive social dislocation. Corporations are already utilizing it to implement mass layoffs. Many of the jobs that have been lost will never come back. The unemployment of millions and millions, tens of millions of people will be used as a sort of whip, not only to force workers back to work under unsafe conditions, but also carry out a further restructuring of class relations to increase the exploitation of workers, which was done after the 2008-2009 crash under the Obama administration. But what they're planning now will be on an even far larger scale to match the far larger scale of the bailouts that they've turned over to Wall Street.
You write in your article that, quote, the conflict between the needs of society and the profit system is not just a theoretical question. It is demonstrated in practice every single day. And I think you've really shown that in this interview. What is the SEP calling for? You're running for president. You're running for president of the United States on behalf of the Socialist Equality Party. And what are you calling on workers to do?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, this is capitalism. And I think that's really, it has to be understood. I mean, the Trump administration is speaking on behalf of a class, of the corporate financial oligarchy, the ruling class that runs capitalist society, in whose interests this society is based. And this is the policy that he is he's implementing. And it's a policy that is fundamentally bipartisan, not only in terms of the bailout of Wall Street, which we spoke about in the CARES Act, but in the Back to Work campaign as well. I mean, I think it is remarkable that even as this is happening, that the government is implementing this policy. There is not within the political establishment any significant opposition. Biden has already signed on to the Back to Work campaign. They are united. Whatever the differences between the Democratic and Republican Party on tactical questions, they are absolutely united on the basic strategic interests of the ruling class. So the question of the fight against the pandemic is now inextricably connected to the fight against capitalism, which means the mobilization of the working class in opposition to the whole political system. It means the development of a movement in the working class to fight for real measures necessary to guarantee the safety and lives of the population. The Socialist Equality Party calls for non-essential production to remain closed. Trillions have to be handed not to Wall Street, but to meet urgent social needs, to ensure the highest quality health care for everyone, that all workers receive full income. These are basic measures which are necessary in order to secure the interests of the working class. But the fight for those policies and the fight against the pandemic is now bound up with the mobilization of the working class against capitalism. The gigantic banks and corporations have to be turned into public utilities under democratic control. The massive wealth that has been hoarded by the corporate and financial elite has to be seized and redirected to meet social need. And the economy, not only in the United States, but all over the world, the economy has to be restructured on the basis of a scientific, rational, democratic plan to meet the needs of society, including in response to the pandemic. I think that's the basic conclusion that flows from this entire situation in the United States and really all around the world.
Well, thanks for joining us today, Joe.
Glad to be here, Zach.
And for everyone watching, you can read Joe's perspective on today's World Socialist website at wsws.org. And you can check out Joe's campaign, his platform of action for the working class, and sign up to get involved in that campaign at socialism2020.org.